Welcome, everyone. We're happy to have you here and happy to talk about some of the exciting work we've been able to do as part of the Transition RTC team. So as Marianne said, we're going to be talking about factors that promote the successful transitions of youth with serious mental health conditions. And as she also said, this is a national picture of youth who receive special education services in high school in the category of emotional disturbance. That isn't the same thing as the larger population of students with serious mental health needs. There are all kinds of underserved, unserved students with such needs, and there are many who are served maybe through the medical system rather than through the transition system. So kids in the category of ED for special education have to have an educational impact of their disability to be qualified for special ed services. So it is a subset of the larger population that is of interest to the RTC here. We're looking at their experiences in terms of their post-high school employment, their participation in post-secondary education, and factors that relate to an increased likelihood of them experiencing those outcomes up to 8 years after high school. And then we're trying to take kind of what is in our field, I think, a unique picture of their outcomes in combining or looking at the pattern of interplay between post-secondary education and employment. It's rarely either or for these kids. It's a both and so we have a way, kind of a new way of looking at those things that we're excited to show you about today. A brief overview, NLTS2 is nationally representative, as Marianne indicated, not just of students with disabilities in this age group, but of students in each disability category. So it was picked from 500 local education agency school districts and 40 special schools, a stratified sample, more than 11,000 students originally, including 1,000 students in the ED category. They're weighted. That's what makes them nationally representative. So each student is weighted with the characteristics of the district from which he was selected. So an LD student from New York City is going to get a heavier weight than an LD student picked in Minot, North Dakota. So that's what makes it nationally representative. It began with students who were ages 13 to 16 at the outset of the study. First data were collected in 2001, and we collected data 5 times over that period. 5 waves of data were collected from parents, 4 waves from youth. There were direct assessments. You know, we called it the NLTS2 van was out there actually doing in-person assessments of the academic achievement of each student one time. And then we did surveys of school staff, and we collected high school transcripts. So we were able to look at the pattern of schooling and achievement for the kids for the years they were in high school. The population itself is 77% male, 61%, that's the highest proportion of maleness of all the disability categories, 61% white, 25% African American, 10% Hispanic. 49% lived in 2-parent households. That's about the lowest percentage of 2-parent family residences of the disability categories. 60% of the heads of household had a high school degree or less. Again, the highest percentage of poorly educated heads of household. 44% had incomes less than $25,000, 30% in poverty. Again, these kids were the most likely of all the disability categories to experience these 3 levels of disadvantage. 63% of them had a secondary disability of ADD or ADHD as reported by parents. These are not diagnosed cases, but parent-reported cases. 30% were reported to have a learning disability, and 20% other, which was soup to nuts. So it's more complicated than the label that special education put on them of ED. There were commingling kinds of disadvantages here, including poverty. 46% of them took medication to affect behavior, mood, or emotions. So those are the kids we're talking about here. First, we'll look at employment after high school. 58% of kids with ED in this category had their primary transition goal. Transition plans have to specify the goals for the student post-high school. 58% had a primary transition goal of getting a job, a competitive job. That's the most common primary transition goal for this population. So let's look at how they did. So here we have 3 bars, and we're looking at 2 things about them. The first bar, the darkest one, is youth in this category of ED, and we're comparing them to the full population of young adults with ED measured in NLTS-2, and then the general population when we had those data. And you can see that at any point, the latest point at which we had data on their employment, 50% of them were employed. That's significantly lower than the full population of students with disabilities and significantly lower than the general population of same-age peers. So half were employed at the time that they were interviewed, the last time we had a hold of them. We asked them, had they ever been employed since high school? And up to that point, they were identical with the full population of students with disabilities, 91%. Virtually 9 out of 10 of both populations had had a job at some point during high school. And you see the story here is that the difference between the 50% and the 91% of currently and ever employed is that this population of young people can find a job, they just have trouble keeping one. So let's look at their employment out of high school, and we see the same persisting pattern. It occurs even in the first 3 years after high school. 42% of them had a job at the time they were interviewed. 73% had had a job at some time during that period. And you see the pattern repeated. The longer they are out of high school, it doesn't change very much. Their current employment goes up a little. It's 60%, 3 to 5 years, 54%, 5 or more years. But it doesn't get much over half, and it's in all cases significantly lower than their rate of having worked for pay at some point in that time period. So that's kind of the picture of employment. We're going to do some analysis of those rates of employment, particularly looking at achieving full-time employment. Full-time employment is the path to having some kind of financial independence. Part-time jobs don't cut it. So we're really looking at whether during that period of time at some point they were able to achieve full-time employment. And we're looking at it in those first 2 years after high school, and then the later period, 2 up to 8 years after high school. And we're supposed to be looking at school-based interventions, or interventions that occur, experiences that occur during high school, and look at their impacts for later. And of course, we think that that impact is going to be more intense in the early years than as other kinds of experiences intervene over a longer period of time. So we looked at a lot of things in terms of interventions, lots of transition planning activities, like did they contact employers. We looked at whether they had career or technical education during high school, course taking in that field. And we looked at whether they had any courses of that kind. And then from the original study that Marianne mentioned, NLTS, the original one in the 80s, we found that a concentration of these kinds of courses in general education, which was measured as 4 or more credits earned in a specific occupational area. So you really did learn how to do something in that at that point, that was a significant predictor of all kinds of good post-school things. So we wanted to take a look at that again. We looked at what their goals were, other kinds of employment-related services, like, did they have job search instruction or help writing a resume, that kind of job training, whether they had worked during high school, whether they got any kinds of services at that point for their mental health condition, and then finally, did they graduate from high school? We looked at all of this as potential interventions to affect their employment outcomes. We looked at that relationship using propensity scoring methods, which is a quasi-experimental way of trying to do what an experiment does and can't. So it tries to create comparable groups by taking a set of covariates that we specify and looking at kind of matching them up, although it doesn't match them one-to-one, but creates groups that have all those covariates in common. They're the same on the covariates. The one thing they don't share is get the intervention. and they try to balance them, twisting this way and that to get balance between them, so that then when you find an impact, it can be generally attributable to the intervention that you're looking at. We used imputation in order to keep our sample size and statistical power high. Now, our programmer calls imputation proc make it up in SAS, and we don't think of it that way exactly, but we do not impute values of the intervention or the outcomes. Those are the real thing. If a student didn't have data on the intervention, we didn't know whether he or she received it, that student did not appear in the models. But the models are weighted, so again, the results are generalizable. And that's what this last bullet means, is we're looking at the average population effect of the treatment for the students who were treated, who had the intervention. What was the effect on them and the population they represent? It was not an effect on the sample that we were looking at. So we used this propensity score modeling technique to create comparison groups that were statistically similar on all of these things that we're looking at. We looked at demographics, the disability. We had scores on measuring social skills and cognitive functioning. Families are important always, so there are measures of family support and family involvement. We looked at education during secondary school. You see them here, and experiences after secondary school. Particularly, we wanted to look at whether institutionalization, either in the criminal justice system or mental health facilities, had an effect here, because clearly that would impact whether a student was able to work. So here we have the effects on full-time employment of the one thing that turned out of all of those analyses to have some impact on these dependent variables. And that is, were they trained to be able to do something by taking CTE courses? So we see in the early years, the first row is the early years, those first 2 years after high school. And taking just any general CTE class didn't have a particular effect there. Taking the concentration, in fact, did have a significant positive effect on finding full-time employment during that period of time. Then we looked at the remaining period of time, and neither of these, there was no effect during that period of either general ed, CTE, or a concentration, because that, as we said, we expected that intervening experiences might well wash out the effects of things that happened during high school. But if we combined them and looked at any time since leaving high school, from the day you left till 8 years later, if that's how long you've been out, we see both those kinds of training had a significant effect. So it tells us that employment training, in fact, can have kind of a lasting effect, particularly that concentration. So let's look descriptively at how many kids had those experiences. And we see that virtually all students in this category at some time had taken some kind of VOC program, CTE program, while they were in high school. And most of them, 86%, even took an occupationally specific CTE program. So it wasn't just like, pre-employment training. It was, I took a business course, but it could have been one business course. Only 26% actually took a concentration in a specific occupational area. And so the benefits of that we've seen related to full-time employment are accruing to a fairly limited population. And we'll talk about some of the implications of that when we get to the end. But wait, there's more, as they say on the shopping channels. Not only did taking a concentration of general ed CTE affect their employment odds after high school, but it significantly increased the odds that youth with ED completed high school. They have the highest dropout rate of any category of kids with disabilities. And anything we can do to up the odds of them actually completing high school is a good thing, because we'll see as Lynn talks about post-secondary education, it's very clear that you might be able to take some kinds of training after high school without a high school graduation, but the options are very limited, and post-secondary education is a huge boost for longer-term adult outcomes. So Lynn is going to take over now and give you a more complicated, a much fuller picture we found a lot more interesting stuff when it comes to predicting post-secondary school enrollment, so you'll be interested to hear about it.
Thanks, Mary. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for choosing to spend some time with us this morning, and we're excited to be able to share with you what we've been learning about the post-secondary school experiences of these young adults. Lots of research has shown that post-secondary education is an important pathway to employment, that it's been linked to higher rates of employment and higher wages. In fact, a recent study by the Federal Reserve Bank found that over the lifetime of an individual who is a college grad, they had earned more than $831,000 a year over that lifetime, compared with someone who had just completed high school. So we're going to begin by taking a look at their rates of enrollment, and then looking at some of the high school experiences that were linked to those rates of enrollment. So first here we're looking at the final data collection in NLTS-2, and at that point these young adults with ED had been out of high school for up to 8 years, and they're 21 to 25 years old. And when we looked actually at the comparison between that original NLTS study and then NLTS-2 15 years later, youth with ED did have a significant increase in their rate of going to post-secondary school. But despite that increase, they are way less likely to go on than their peers. What we have here, the dark blue bars, are the experiences of those young adults with ED, and the pale blue bars are the experiences of their peers in the general population, the same age peers. So that's going to be the case for the rest of the slides that we'll be looking at here. Only 2 out of 5 go on to any form of post-secondary education, and that's compared with about 2/3 of those of their peers. For those who do go on, they're more likely to go to a community college than to other kinds of schools. And in fact, if you look at their rate of enrollment at a 4-year college, it's less than 1/4 of their peers. 9% go on, compared with 40%. So we wanted to find out what kinds of experiences during high school would be able to impact the likelihood of their going on to post-secondary education. And we looked at a range of experiences that the research literature would lead us to think would be related to increasing the likelihood of a student continuing that education. And we used that same quasi-experimental propensity modeling approach that Mary just described. And most of the covariates that describe the young adults with ED that Mary included in her analysis were the same as those I've included here, except that because these have a post-secondary focus, we included a few additional ones. So for example, looking at their achievement levels on reading and math subtests of the Woodcock-Johnson standardized tests of academic achievement. So actually many of those experiences that we looked at were not significantly related, very similar to the kinds of experiences Mary was finding with employment, but I'm going to be able to share with you at least some of those that were. We tried to control for whether or not, if you dropped out of high school, you could complete fewer credits. So we wanted to look at academic credits as a proportion of the overall credits that you earned, so that controls for whether or not you had dropped out. So independent of dropping out, students who earned a higher proportion of credits, academic credits, were more likely to go on to a 2- or 4-year college. But we didn't see a relationship with CTE schools. And taking those general education CTE credits that Mary just discussed, or that occupationally specific concentration of CTE, that career and technical education credits, were not related to going on to either to a 4-year college or to a career or technical education post-secondary school. Not surprisingly, though, GPA in those academic courses was related to going on to a 2-year or 4-year or a CTE school. So in a way, many of these findings feel obvious, But the thing to keep in mind here is that usually in most analyses, it's very, very difficult to distinguish the difference between the impact of the differences in students who are more likely to take those academic courses and the impact of the courses themselves. And that's one of the strong benefits of using an approach like propensity modeling, so that we can know that independent of those characteristics that we measured, so independent of academic ability of those students, that the types of courses that you take during high school matters in terms of going on to post-secondary school. So looking descriptively, here we have credits that were earned based on their high school transcripts. The credits are expressed as Carnegie units. And what that is, it's you get 1 credit for a typical high school course. So that's one that meets about 40 minutes a day for every day of the week for a year. We see that students with ED had earned significantly fewer credits during high school. And that's in part because they drop out, much more likely to drop out than their peers. And also they're, as you will see in a little bit, more likely to fail their courses. And these are credits that they've actually earned and have successfully completed. They've also earned fewer of those academic courses, the kinds of courses that you need to get into post-secondary school, fewer credits there. Their rate of taking career and technical education courses are the same as their peers, but they were less likely to take other kinds of courses, music, PE, art. GPAs also lower, 2.0 versus 2.7, and as you see here, more than three-quarters of these students had failed at least 1 course, and that's much, much higher than the less than half of those of their peers who had failed at least 1 of their high school courses. Now, taking a look at transition planning. High schools are mandated by the special education laws to have transition planning meetings and to have a whole process around helping the students plan during high school for that period immediately post-high school to help them more successfully make that transition, that bridge to post-secondary life. And we explored a wide range of aspects of transition planning. We did find many were not significantly related to going on, but those that we did find were related. That students who took a leadership role during those meetings that were held, usually annually, starting at the age of either 14 to 16, depending on the state you live in, those students were more likely to go on to post-secondary school. So, that could be due in part to differences in students that we were not able to measure, unobserved covariates, but it also could be that those students who took those leadership roles were more likely to learn the self-determination and the self-advocacy types of skills that you need in order to successfully enroll in and apply to and enroll in post-secondary schools. We found that having a post-secondary school representative at your meeting was extremely important. One of the strong intentions of the special education law is a collaboration and coordination between high schools and post-high school kind of service providers, schools, employers. And we find that when there was some kind of coordination, that did impact whether or not the student went on. So looking descriptively, we find that most students with ED had attended their meetings, but their role within those meetings really varied widely. About a third of those students came to their meetings but really didn't participate very much at all. They were just there. Half provided some input, and 11% took that important leadership role. Fewer than a quarter of the students had had any kind of contact made on their behalf with 2-year or 4-year colleges or CTE schools, despite that intention of the law of that coordination between high schools and post-secondary schools. 18% had had a 2 or 4-year contacted, 23% CTE schools, and very few, only 2%, had that important representative at their attending their transition planning meetings. So we know actually from all of the research that's been done looking at successful transition planning that the goals that are set by students along with their parents and their school staff should be at the heart of transition planning. Those goals should drive the whole planning process. And when we looked at the actual transition plans and what kind of goals they had on their plans, students who held a goal of attending a 2- or 4-year college, those students were more likely to go on to 2- or 4-year college. But those who had a goal of attending a CTE school as a primary goal on their transition plan were not more likely to go on to either kind of school. But in addition to looking at their transition plans and looking at the goals on the plan, we were able to actually go and speak to the youth when they were back in high school and ask them to kind of envision their life after high school and talk about their expectations, how likely they thought it would be that they would attend post-secondary school. And those students who felt that they would attend post-secondary school actually were the ones who did end up going. Students whose parents expected them to attend post-secondary school also much more likely to go on. So it looks like expectations clearly are very important. And again, keeping in mind that that's independent of the characteristics, the academic abilities of these students. So for example, if you took 2 students who were identical in every way that we measured in our models, including their GPA, their academic achievement, the student whose parents expect them to go on to post-secondary school is the one who's going to attend college. So when we looked at those transition plans, 44% of the students had a goal of going on to 2- or 4-year college. 44% had a goal of going to a CTE school. It appears that students were pretty optimistic, probably overly optimistic at the time that they were in high school when we looked at the 43% who did go on. 56% expected that they definitely would attend. 30% thought they probably would, and 14% didn't think that they were going. Parents were likely a little bit more realistic. 19% expected that their child would continue. 39% thought that they probably would, and 42% thought that their child definitely wouldn't or probably wouldn't. And as Mary said, not surprisingly, completing high school is strongly linked to whether or not you go on to a 2- or 4-year college, but not to a CTE school. And many students do go on to career technical education schools, not having completed their high schools. But just going to post-secondary school is really only part of the story. You don't really get the benefits, those employment benefits, the higher wages, the higher employment rates, if you don't actually complete your program. So looking at completion rates, only 49%, less than half of those who attended a post-secondary school finished. And that's not really that much different than their peers, but really that's not a great rate for either group. And that's something that we as a country are beginning to focus on, is getting students who are in post-secondary schools successfully through their programs. And if you look at the rate at 4-year colleges, really low. 15% of those who had enrolled in a 4-year college had made it all the way through to graduation. So we wanted to begin to explore what were some of the factors that could increase the likelihood of these young adults finishing their post-secondary school program. And we decided to take a look at receipt of additional kinds of accommodations and supports while you're in post-secondary school to see if that made a difference in terms of graduation. So what we have here, again, are results of propensity modeling, 3 sets of analysis. The first set looked at disability-specific accommodations or services, and that's the kind of help that you get. You need to disclose a disability to your post-secondary school in order to get those kinds of supports. Things like additional time on tests, getting to take your tests in a quiet place, other kinds of supports at these initial analysis, we're not finding that receipt of those kinds of supports make a difference in terms of completion. But we did find that students who sought out and received the kinds of supports that were available to the general student body, so going to a tutor that the school provides, or going to the study center or a writing center or a math center, those students were significantly more likely to make their way through successfully a 2- or a 4-year college program. Also, students who were able to get some help on their own outside of what the school provided, so again, maybe hiring a tutor, were more likely to complete their program. And for these models, what's interesting is that we even included some additional kinds of covariates so that we took into account all of the high school preparation of those students. So independent of even their proportion of academic courses that they took and the GPAs that they had in high school, independent of all of those aspects, just getting help in college seems to make a difference. Taking a look at that levels of receipt, though, very few, only 18% got disability-specific help, and that's not surprising since very, very few students with ED disclose their disability. They actually have one of the lowest rates of disclosure at the post-secondary level among youth with disabilities. 42% had gotten some supports, had gone to those study centers, gotten tutors provided by the schools, and 39% had gotten help on their own. But what's concerning is that more than half of these students actually had not received any kind of support if you look across all the different kinds of supports together. And we had asked those students who had not gotten any help if they thought it would have been helpful, and a third of those students asserted that receiving those kinds of accommodations or supports or services would have been helpful for them to have been successful in their post-secondary programs. So we're beginning to see that getting some of those additional supports really does make a difference in terms of making your way through to college graduation, especially in 2- and 4-year colleges. So now Mary is going to be back to kind of put it all together and take a look at an overarching view of both post-secondary education and employment.
Thank you, Lynn. So we went the next step. Again, we've looked at employment, we've looked at post-secondary, but the most common post-high school experience, and not just for youth with ED, I mean, it was my experience, it was probably your experience, that we combine employment and post-secondary education participation. It's unusual for many, many students to be able to get through post-secondary ed without working at the same time. And we know that those combinations fluctuate over time, and that we wanted to see how that fluctuation affected the patterns that were there. So we created some patterns of engagement over time, and that gives us a more complete picture of what life is like for these young adults than looking at either outcome independently or looking at it in one slice in time. So the NLTS2 data support examining these patterns over a 4-year period for young adults with ED who had 2 waves of data after leaving high school, so that you could see a pattern from one time period to another. Now, I've shared earlier results with Marianne and other people on the RTC team where we tried to look over a 6-year period, and in fact there were just too few youth with ED who had 3 waves of data post-high school for us to get any kind of power in our analyses. So we backed down to a 4-year period, which isn't nearly as it doesn't give us as full a picture, but it lets us do some kinds of analyses that help explain what we're looking at better. So here are the patterns of engagement. We looked at engagement, meaning they could have had full-time employment, part-time employment, or any form of post-secondary education. Any one of those things in a slice in time would have you being counted as engaged during that time period. And so we calculated the various combinations of those things over the 2 points in high school, and here they are. Could have worked full-time, been in school, you're really maxed out on your energy level there. Full-time job, that's all you're doing, you're not going to school. Part-time job, you can see the combinations. And down at the bottom is not employed and not in school. So that's at a particular slice in time. We had no evidence of either employment or post-secondary enrollment. And here are the percentages of those combinations that we saw over the 2 time periods. So being disengaged, the very first line is they were not working and they were not in school. 41% in that first slice of time, in their first 2 years after high school, there was no evidence for 41% of youth that they had any kind of work or post-secondary education. That had dropped by about half in their next 2 years. So there was some easing into or achieving some kind of engagement, a part-time job. It could have been going to a CTE school. It might have been college, that they finally kind of got their act together to do something like that. So there is growth, positive growth there, from disengagement to some form of engagement. They could have been not working but in school. You see those are kind of don't change very much over time. Part-time work, actually, with no school, part-time work alone, actually was cut in half over time. Full-time work actually increased marginally. Some of these are not statistically significant, but we're looking at patterns here. Part-time work and in school, again, slight difference, not very much. And full-time work and in school, actually almost quadrupled. So that went from 6% to a little more than 20% of kids were both working full-time and taking courses on the side. So now let's figure out what, we put those things together over the time periods then. So we just saw what they were doing at the 2 points in time, but let's put the pattern together. And we find that there is a disengaged group here where they're not engaged at either point. No work, no school, no work, no school. So those we're calling disengaged, fully disengaged. We have partially engaged, which is at one point in time they were doing either work or school in some combination, but only at one of the 2 time periods. And then we have what we consider in this analysis the most positive outcome, which is consistently over these 4 years, the youth there was some evidence at some point in both time periods that they were working or going to school or both. So those are the patterns now we're going to try to understand in a kind of predictive way. And here are their prevalence. Fully disengaged at neither time point was gratefully fairly uncommon. Partially engaged was also 22% here. So we really only have about 1/3 of the population were not fully engaged at both time points. But again, it could have been part-time job, no school, taken a couple of classes, not working, but at least it was consistent over time that this youth was involved in something outside, in the outside world, in his community or her community. So that's the prevalence. And let's look at kind of who fell into these buckets. And again, this is not propensity modeling. This is just logistic regression with some of the covariates we then went on to use in the propensity models. There was not a gender difference or an age difference here in who fell into the disengaged versus engaged buckets. Mother's educational level, though, was a protective factor against youth being fully disengaged. A better educated mother, we chose mother because so many of these kids were living in single-parent households. And there is some literature that says that's actually the most predictive measure of adult education level in a household. So it's a protective factor against disengagement and positively affects the likelihood, the odds of a youth being fully engaged. Contrary to what we often think, being white or Asian relative to other ethnicities worked against these youth if, and again, this is the importance here, if you controlled for everything else about them, if the income was the same, the mother's educational level was the same, the parents' expectations for their outcomes were the same, in fact, being white or Asian was a disadvantage. It promoted disengagement and was a protective, it worked against being fully engaged. You might remember several, at about graduation time in April or May, when college acceptances were going around, there was a story of an immigrant young black man who, in fact, applied to all the Ivies. He had come here as maybe an 8 or 9-year-old with his family and applied to all the Ivy League schools and got into every single one of them, which almost never happened. So I think it's something like that we're seeing here. We often get race, ethnicity, but mangled with the other kinds of socioeconomic things that go with it. And in fact, if you can disentangle them, this is what we find. Household income being greater than $50,000, of course, help being fully engaged. It does promote post-secondary education in particular. Here are other factors we looked at. Again, this is not the propensity modeling. These are just characteristics of the youth. It really helps to graduate from high school, and again, that has a lot to do with the post-secondary options available to you. It doesn't influence, particularly whether you had worked in high school doesn't help here. It doesn't hurt you, apparently, having been arrested in high school. That has no impact that we were able to find. Social skills scale score. If you have higher social skills, in fact, you're less likely to be disengaged, more likely to be fully engaged. And level of family support for education at home was not independently related. So now we want to do the propensity modeling that we talked about earlier to identify practices and interventions that protect against disengagement or promote engagement, as we've seen before for employment and post-secondary separately. Graduating from high school makes a big difference. Again, as an intervention, when you've got balanced groups in every other covariate that we had in the analyses, it's very important that we get youth graduated, which again, they have the highest dropout rate because they have the highest course failure rate. If they can't pass their courses, they get discouraged. I'm never going to graduate. I'm 3 credits behind. I'm never going to graduate. I give this up. And so there's a lot of incentive here to help with that graduation business. Again, if they stay, the proportion of credits earned, no matter how many they were, even if they dropped out, the proportion of academic general ed courses the credits earned in those courses was a protective factor against disengagement. Taking general ed CTE courses in general and not even taking a concentration of general education courses really had an effect here. It did for employment alone, but you put it together with post-secondary education, and that doesn't cut it. Plans and expectations. So again, Lynn explained that there were transition plan goals, and then there were parents' expectations. And if the parent expected that the youth definitely would attend post-secondary school, he wasn't likely to end up not doing anything. If they expected he would find paid employment, he in fact was out there fully engaged at both points in time. And again, becoming financially self-supporting. Do you think at some point this young person in your life is going to be able to stand economically on his own 2 feet? And if they believed that, the youth was unlikely to be fully disengaged. The transition planning goal of enrolling in post-secondary education was hugely powerful for full engagement. And if the goal had either form of engagement, either employment or going on to college, that was a protective factor against disengagement. But having competitive employment, as we looked at, 56% of these youth did, finding competitive employment as a primary goal was not significantly related to either end of the engagement scale. So some of the implications, and I'm sure we could have a wonderful conversation about what the implications of all this are, but we see the importance of parents here, and we have throughout our view of these kids, that they can be encouraged to have high expectations for their children regarding high school graduation and post-secondary success. And given the high proportion of less well-educated parents here, poorer parents who have probably not obviously been educated after high school themselves, they may not have those high expectations. And we've been able to show that independent of those other SES factors, the expectations make a difference. We know that supports for success in academic courses could be helpful here. GPA powerfully predicts high school graduation, and these kids fail more courses than any other group, and they're largely academic courses. So we have some analyses, and other research has shown that providing learning supports can improve the odds of graduating from high school and completing post-secondary education. And some of those learning supports are in short supply, particularly with the economic conditions of many large school districts today. And transition planning could be could create a stronger bridge from high school to post-high school life. It's important to encourage active parent and student participation in that goal setting. If the parents and the youth buy the goals, shape the goals, in fact, it has an effect for later on. If the youth has a goal of employment as a primary transition goal, encouraging a concentration of CTE for those, particularly those not at risk of not graduating on time, might be an effective strategy. Including both academic and CTE teachers in the transition planning would create a more holistic view of the student's program and a broader view of the options available to him or her. And more effective outreach to potential employers. And Lynn gave the data on whether post-secondary school representatives were involved in transition planning, and it was quite low. Only 24% and 29% of youth who had a goal of going on to employment had any contacts made with employers or job placement agencies. So the youth were getting no help and actually, set the goal fine, but there was no active help in the transition planning process for them to achieve that goal. So that's what we have to share with you today. We were going to be finished by 10 our time, and we've given extra time for conversation. We do want to encourage you to look at the NLTS2 website. There's a gold mine there because the study is incredibly rich. All the reports that we wrote over 10 years and some of papers that we've published since then are there. There are a whole series of fact sheets and data briefs that are there. If you don't want to do full reports, there's executive summaries of everything. And every item, every data item in every data collection instrument, all 5 waves of data collection, the items are tabled, the results are tabled on the website. There's a fairly easy to follow way of looking. You pick what instrument you want. We want the kid interview. And then, okay, we want to know about employment, and it takes you through a way to find the various items that are there. So you can know virtually everything we know. And there's the website. And so now, do we need...
And one other thing, if any of you out there are researchers and are interested in the actual data set, the data itself is now available as a restricted data set from IES, and how to get that data set is up on the website. In addition, there's a bunch of folks across the country, lots of researchers are now beginning to do secondary analysis of NLTS2, and we've started a NLTS2 community of practice. And if you're interested then in joining that community of practice, that's also information on how to do that is up on that website. So a good place to check.
So now, Amanda, do we turn this back to you?
So sure. So actually what we're going to do now is have our question and answer session. So we would ask the participants, if you have a question, to please click on the little hand icon. And what will happen is we will call on you through our software, and then we will unmute you so that you can ask your question. We're still going to keep everyone muted for the time being, just so that we can eliminate any background noise. So like I said, please feel free to click on the hand icon, and we'll call on you as we see your hand.
Either that, or you can type your question in directly into the chat feature. And we actually did receive a chat feature question from Kelly Henderson. And Lynn and Mary, Kelly asked, did you have any information on the prevalence of youth who were not in the care of a birth parent or step-parent, for example, foster youth in kinship care, etc., and if there is any correlation with the post-secondary outcomes you examined?
The answer to the first question is yes, we have those data. It's a sliver of kids. There are larger numbers that have been in and out, but at the point that we had talked to them, we have not done analyses of that subgroup of youth. And the data tables on the web don't break it down that way. On the web, you can look at by disability category, by time out of school, by income and gender, I think, but not something as fine-grained as that.
And unfortunately, we rarely were able to follow those youth after the first round of interviews, because legally, we tried very hard to get contact information. If they were moved to another family, the foster family was not allowed to give us that information, and we followed up with social service agencies and rarely could get any of that information. So I think We've never looked at that, but I think that that is a group we probably have a larger non-response for than other groups.
Yeah, they were emancipated at 18 in many cases, and so after that, you know, we had no way to track them.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Krista, and Krista, we'll unmute you if you want to ask it yourself. That's fine.
Hi, Mary and Lynn. Can you hear me? This is Krista.
Hi, Krista.
Great presentation, great data analysis as always. Thank you for doing this. Just curious, I was just rereading your 2012 article the other night, and still amazed at the number of kids that are arrested post leaving high school. I think it's over 60% of these kids are arrested up to 8 years after leaving high school. And I saw your variable about arrested while in high school, because we know about a third of these kids are arrested during high school. But what's your feeling on the influence of arrest on employment and schooling post high school?
Well, we did look at whether they've been incarcerated, because you don't know that an arrest, an arrest might not lead to anything. An arrest is an event. And, I mean, it indicates that their behavior is such that somebody found something difficult to deal with in society. But what we looked at was whether the incarceration or institutionalization being, it could be hospitalized as well, whether that had any impact here. That was a covariate. We didn't look at it as an intervention, but it was a covariate. So we controlled for that in trying to look at what other things might have influenced the outcomes.
Krista, did that answer your question?
Yeah, and I that you controlled for it, but I'm still thinking that it's hard to get a job if you have an arrest record. I'm still perplexed by that variable.
Yeah, and we might consider it an intervention in a negative sense.
Right.
That if that's an experience of the youth, what difference does that make, independent of other things? And that's not a hard thing to do. We could do that for you, Krista.
Thank you.
I think that's an interesting point. I think we have been so focused on high school interventions and what high schools can do that makes a difference, and then in post-secondary school, what the schools there can do that makes a difference. We haven't really been exploring as much kind of other aspects of their lives, but that is a good idea.
You'd have to ask Mary Ann whether she'd let us do that.
We'll have to see what we can arrange. Since we're on that topic, actually that was one of the things that struck me in your slides as well was the high school arrest data. Given that was a regression, presumably your data suggests that what we typically see with juveniles who have been arrested, there's probably stronger data about whether they've been adjudicated delinquent or not. But typically, arrest is associated with not completing high school, having difficulties in all kinds of areas of life. But from your data, I think it's suggesting that it's not the arrest per se, but it may be the impact that arrest has on not completing high school. Do you think it's consistent with that interpretation?
I think that's a reasonable interpretation. We actually are doing some analyses of what predicts high school graduation, and that certainly can be included in that work.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah, I mean, the overwhelming data about how important it is to, from your data and from others as well, but for your data for this population about how important it is to complete high school, and completing it on time, that was one of the other variables that you reported on. It's to be mindful that timely completion is also really important to be engaged in schooling or working at both time points after high school is really important.
It is, though there is a real high incidence of this population of youth eventually completing. We have kind of an eventual completer who goes back for a GED or goes back. So there is some kind of credential available to more youth than that graduate on time makes appear. It doesn't often carry the same quality in the outside world, however.
Right. I mean, so I took that the finding on graduating on time in some ways to reflect exactly that the society values sort of classic completion of high school, and there may be sort of a bit of a ding you take for even if you complete high school, but you do it through a GED or through a slower process, possibly.
We often call that person who graduates on time a persister, and I think that's part of the value we place on it, is the person who sticks it out and gets the job done.
Yep, absolutely. Do we have other questions?
Okay, so I see that Eileen has a question.
Give us 1 second. We're just
sorry, okay, Eileen, take it away. Eileen?
Is she unmuted now?
Well, we can ask the question for Eileen, because she did also type it in. Eileen asked, how should families use this information to get their transition age youth help? And Eileen, you are unmuted, so if you want to jump in at any point and add to that question, feel free. I think you have yourself muted, so if you unmute on your end as well, that might be why we can't hear you.
Ah, there you go.
You know, I think that it would be important for parents to, I mean, it's always so important for parents to be advocates for children. And that's something, you know, it's kind of a circular, how do you get parents to be advocates, is by often schools need to begin to support them, or outside agencies need to begin to help parents, especially parents who haven't completed high school, have less education themselves, are not comfortable in the school system. And yet, you know, we need to, as a community of people, begin to advocate for high schools to, and parents need to be sure that the high schools are performing those really important kinds of linkages for their child when they are in high school, to get that coordination going with those employers, with post-secondary schools, to be sure that there are representatives at those meetings. So I think that's really a very important part, in addition to, you know, working with parents themselves to help them raise their expectations. But in terms of what parents can do, I think that, you know, parents need to be educated about the importance of schools performing that high schools getting that link for their students to those post-secondary institutions.
We actually have a paper under review right now that's looked at the rate of service receipt by this population while they were in high school, and then in 2-year periods of time after high school. And we see that there is, it's not as bad as falling off a cliff, but there is certainly a reduction in the total number of services received at one time, and significant reductions in particular kinds of services received. And it's interesting what Lynn said about the high school, is that even in the post-high school years, parents are more likely to rely on, it's still one of their first sources of information about help for their student as they go back to the high school. They also are more likely to depend on friends and family, because that's all they may be comfortable or know how to reach out. There's not a lot of accessing of services through, I mean, some online, some the parent education centers, but it's the friends and family and the high school they knew when the kid went to school there are the sources of information. And interestingly, with the reduction in the services their young adult children receive, the level of satisfaction they have, the parents report, with the services actually increases. So I interpret that, and of course it's only a perspective on it, not a fact, that they feel lucky to get what they get, rather than have some sense of my adult child is not getting what he or she needs. Because it really is an odd relationship that the services go down and the satisfaction goes up.
Great. Lynn and Mary, Eileen had a follow-up asking, what should you do if this was not done in high school and your transition age youth has attempted post-secondary but has not completed and is struggling?
Well, I think the largest and most important learning that we're beginning to find is that they need to get some additional help. Interestingly, you know, we're not finding that disability-specific help is making such a difference. In a way, that's good, because so few students with any kind of disability disclose their disability to their post-secondary school. So it's reassuring to see that independent of that, getting those tutors, going to the writing centers, going to the study centers, getting that additional support, because when they were in high school, 90% of these students with ED got some kind of accommodation or support. It's probably that additional level of accommodation and support that they had in high school that allowed them to be successful enough to go on to post-secondary school. Now, a year or two later, they're at post-secondary school and they're tackling college-level work without the same kinds of supports that they got when they were in high school. So clearly, they need some additional help outside of just what the general classes are providing. So, getting that help on your own, that was one of the findings that related to higher rates of completion at both 2- and 4-year schools, as well as getting it from the school. So they need to kind of seek out and understand that they're not going to be successful if they're just going and taking their classes.
And one of the things that gets in the way of their doing that is we ask the youth who were in post-secondary, and we ask the same thing about youth who were employed. Did they request accommodation? Did they out themselves? Did they self-identify? And the youth, one of the most frequent responses, this category was more likely than any other category of youth to say, I don't have a problem.
Right.
I am not disabled. I don't need anything. I'm okay. So the fact that they were in special ed when they were in high school was something about high school, and they've left all that behind. So it's that self-determination kind of thing. The self-awareness of, I really do need help, what Lynn just said. I needed it when I was in high school. I'm going to need it now. I need to go find it. It is very hard to do for someone who doesn't acknowledge that need.
But also high schools are remiss in that in many high school students do not understand, A, that they are getting some additional support, B, why are they getting that support. The laws that govern high schools are very different than those that will govern post-secondary schools. In high school, the burden is on the school to find and to serve that student. And students really don't have to play an active role in any of that. When you switch to post-secondary school, the laws completely change, and now the burden is fully on that youth. They need to understand, what their issues are, very clearly be able to articulate what they need and why they need it. And those are the kinds of skills. In fact, interesting in other work that we're doing is that I'm finding that the students who get more help in post-secondary school are those who either had gotten from their high school transition education courses. Some high schools, a little bit more than half, had offered courses that are focused on the kind of help in decision-making and kind of focused on what the issues you face when you transition. And then part of your transition plan is the school needs to indicate what services they think you need to have when you leave. And what's really fascinating is that when a transition plan specifies on it that when you leave, you're going to need to get accommodations and supports in post-secondary school, those students are more likely to go on and get post-secondary school help. And that's surprising to anybody who's a parent, that they actually listen to you, and that they did listen to what the high schools had to say and went out and got it. So it's that need at the high school level to educate people to better understand what their issues are and for them to then be able to actively seek that out when they're in post-secondary school.
I just wanted to follow up, this is Mary Ann, really quickly on the point about when students go to post-secondary education and the burden is basically on them to request accommodations. I think it's also then gets complicated by often disability offices at 2- and 4-year colleges often don't seem to understand the needs of this population particularly well. So they have the additional, so they have the stigma of a mental health condition, the burden of it being on them to request accommodations, and sometimes, even if they inquire about it, the staff in the Disability Services Office sometimes really don't understand, and so there are a lot of things to dissuade them from requesting accommodations that could be very helpful to them, requesting and being able to get them. So it's more than even just a double whammy.
And that's all true, but I think the part that's why we were so excited to see that getting the kinds of help that's available to everyone at the college.
Yes, absolutely. Yep, that's very helpful.
I don't think we see any other questions. We can give people another minute if they need to raise their hand. Actually, Catherine Hall, we're going to unmute you. We just saw you just raise your hand. You are unmuted if you want to ask your question. Are you there, Catherine?
She may be muted herself.
Yeah, it doesn't look like she's self-muted, but it does look like you're calling in with a microphone speaker, so I'm wondering if you might be having technical difficulties with your audio on your computer. You are welcome to type in the question, and we can ask it aloud for you if you're not able to get through verbally with your microphone.
Action going on with
That is, oh, well, someone else while we're waiting. Linda Simmons just asked, is it possible to receive these handouts for printing?
That's
Why,
fine
yes,
with
it is.
Yes. We're happy to share them. So what would be the best way for people to get those?
Amanda, take it away.
You can actually send it to me, to Amanda Elenoff, and I can distribute it.
That's to Lynn and Mary, that they can send you the slides.
Yes.
You can distribute them.
Correct.
We have already. Amanda has those slides.
Yes, I do, actually.
And we will also have the audio recording of the presentation, which will follow the PowerPoint slides directly, and I believe that will be posted on our website within the next week or two, and we can e-blast that out to all attendees as well. So you'll have all of the discussion sections and the PowerPoint slides that will go with them.
And we can put it on the NLTS2 website as well.
Fantastic.
So we just got a few more questions in. Linda was able, oh, no, I'm sorry, Catherine Hall was able to send in her question via chat and said, have you looked at the rates of students that can transport themselves independently to work or school and rates of getting a driver's license?
We actually haven't looked at that. We do know whether they had a driver's license, and we do know whether they have a job, and we do know how they usually get around. So that's actually a doable question to take a look at, but we have not done that.
Well, we have their wages. We do have the final report, the Wave 5 report, that's kind of at the top of the list of the reports on the NLTS2 website, close to the top. It's the one that's something about like they're having been out of school up to 8 years. That one has sections on their driver's license, on their employment, a lot of descriptive information, especially on wages and how many are above their actual wages and then above minimum wage and things like that. Lots of information that we are not sharing descriptively are available in that report.
We've had a follow-up from Catherine. I don't know if you already answered this, but she did say, does it have any impact upon reaching goals?
Does what? I'm not sure. Does having the driver's license?
Yeah, I would say yes.
We just haven't looked at that.
Okay.
It's an interesting question because it is such a concrete capacity to have.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting question that way.
Yeah. Linda said, thank you for a wonderful presentation. It has been wonderful. Thank you so much. And you got a question from someone else asking, is there any opportunity to partner in doing transition research? And I may butcher her last name, but I think it's Lisa Siroy.
Well, we partner with a lot of people, and everyone should know that there actually is a community of practice of Lynn may have mentioned this earlier, of NLTS2 researchers that's being moderated or kind of organized by UNC Charlotte, David Test there in the Transition Center. And that's a really good opportunity to look. There's on the website, there's on, not our website, but maybe we have it too, but on the Community of Practice, NLTS2 Community of Practice website, there's a bibliography of all the studies and work that different people are doing, which would give that requester a sense of what's already kind of going on out there and who's involved.
Right, and David Test, actually, when you join the community's practice, you're asked, and what are your key focus areas? So David actually knows, if you contacted him, you know, what other researchers, all the researchers that are focused across the country on different aspects of looking at NLTS2.
Great, thank you. And another quick comment is that the Transitions RTC is in the process of creating a LinkedIn account for our center where we will be collaborating with other researchers in the field doing work in transition. And also LinkedIn is just a great website in general for transition researchers to stay in contact. So we will be sending out information about that LinkedIn as it develops.
Great.
We're thrilled that somebody is expressing interest in working and doing more research in transition age youth. Yes.
Yes.
We'll help in any way we can.
I think that is all of our questions.
Well, we certainly appreciate the opportunity to share some of what we've been doing. It's been just great.
Thank you all, really. Thank you for the time.
Oh, we thank you for sharing this really interesting, wonderful data with us and with everybody online. And we look forward to seeing more coming out of your shop on this topic and related topics, and more work together in the future.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, everybody.